So welcome to the ArgLab Research Colloquium, the permanent seminar of the Reasoning and Argumentation Lab at the Universidade Nova de Lisboa. Before starting to introduce the guest speakers of this last appointment for this academic year, let me remind you we are recording and broadcasting live this seminar, so please disable your video now if you would rather not appear. I'm pleased to introduce Raquel Silva, Rute Costa, and Sara Carvalho, that are integrated researchers of the Lexicology, Lexicography, and Terminology group of the Linguistics Research Center at our university. I'd like to give you some more information about each of them, starting with Raquel Silva. Raquel has a PhD in linguistics, and she has been teaching several degrees and master courses in her area of specialization of lexicology, lexicography, and terminology. Raquel is also doing research in the field of health literacy, and she's the head of health literacy in the Collaborative Laboratory Value for Health, a laboratory funded by the Portuguese government, whose mission is to help people and organizations to measure the value in health. Rute Carvalho is Associate Professor with tenure and habilitation in linguistics and has important institutional roles within our university. Let me at least mention that here at the Nova University, she is head of the Linguistic Center, coordinator of Lexicology, Lexicography, and Terminology group, and the scientific coordinator of the PhD program in Translation and Terminology. Her research got recognition also on an international basis. She is part of various European projects and scientific initiatives. For example, Rute was president of the European Association for Terminology. Apart from being an integrated researcher at the Nova Linguistic Center, Sara Carvalho is also a collaborator of the Languages, Literatures and Cultures Research Center of the University of Aveiro, where she is an assistant professor. Like Raquel and Rute, Sara has a PhD in linguistics. She also did some specialized training within the scope of e-health, and she's part of European projects as well. For example, she's a member of the Costa Nexus Linguarum, a European network for web-centered linguistic data science. In this project, she's the leader of the working group on use cases and applications. I don't want to take up too much time. I'm eager to listen to you and to explore possible connections together with you, possible connections of your research within our area of expertise in the context of reasoning and argumentation. Let me just announce the title of Raquel, Rute, and Sara's talk, that is Terminology, a pivotal element in knowledge sharing in the digital age. I'll give you the word and welcome to the ArgLab Research Colloquium.
So thank you very much to Maria Grazia for her presentation. Thank you to Maria Grazia and Tilma for inviting us to present our work. We are very happy to do so, and we are very happy to be able to share with you, since we think that we have probably some connections and some points that are interesting for both of our research groups. So I'm going to present our presentation will be divided. We are three orders, but I'm going to focus on the theoretical part, on the context part, and Sara Carvalho, she's going to present the applications that we are working on in our group. So the first thing I would like to show you is our group. So we are mainly 6 PhD in this group. So you can recognize Raquel, Sara, but we also have Margarida and Salgado and Bruno Almeida. We are all working in this group. So as mentioned, Raquel is more dedicated to terminology and healthcare. Sara and Margarida, they are related to ontologies. Margarida is also working on text mining, and Bruno is working with information science, whereas Ana Salgado is working in lexicography and in the context of digital humanities. So this is our group, and what I'm going to present is at the basis of everything that we are doing. And Sara, as I said, is going to present the applications. So the outline is we are going very quickly to talk about our background. I'm going to focus on the theoretical part of terminology, and Sara is going to talk about the 4 examples that we are working on, and she's going to do the concluding remarks. So very quickly, so right now we have 6 ongoing finance projects. So we have More Digital, this project that has been financed by FCT. So it's lexicography, ontology, and digital humanities. We have the digital edition of the Vocabulário Ortográfico da Língua Portuguesa. So it's in the same line that More Digital. We were awarded with an Erasmus Plus program. So humanities going digital. We have probably our first meeting in September this year. And we have these 4 projects, so communication for interactive rehabilitation in virtual reality. So it had been awarded last year by Santander. Our Alexis program, so it's a program that it's an European infrastructure. The project will end in February 2022, so we are coming to the end. We have Dexus Linguarium, where Sara is active, and we have Western Sephardic Diaspora Roadmap, where Margarida Ramos is active. Talking about our domains, so sorry for those who are from the domain, so this is mainly for our colleagues who don't know the branch, I would say. So terminology science is what we do. So it's a science that's studying terminologies, aspects of terminology work, the resulting terminology resources and terminological data. As you can see, the philosophy is related to what is done in ISO TC37. ISO TC37 is the technical committee for terminology and language. And so we are all working in this group for some time right now. So I'm a member of ISO since 2000. Terminology is also considered to be the set of designation and concepts belonging to one domain or subject. I think most people who, when they hear the term terminology, they think more about designation and concept than the science per se. So what is our concern? Well, our concern is that, in fact, terminology work is multidisciplinary, and we draw support from a number of disciplines. And as you can see, logic, epistemology, philosophy of science, linguistics, information science, and cognitive science. And so the idea is to study the concept and their representation in special language and also in general language. And we will see when it comes to general language, we are more talking about popularization, And in fact, what we pretend to do, and that's what we do in our research group, is it combines elements from many theoretical approaches that deal with the description, ordering, and transfer of knowledge. So what we do is describe, order, and transfer knowledge. So how do we do? In fact, we think that terminology, well, it's more effective knowledge, representation, organization, and sharing. And what we want is to have more effective and efficient communication among the several stakeholders. And we will show you in our application how we want to do this. So what is our purpose? Well, in fact, in terminology, we have, of course, the specialized knowledge that is produced by the experts community. So everybody produce specialized knowledge in some professional context. This specialized knowledge has the reverse. So we have to talk about this specialized knowledge. So we have the verbal communication, and our concern is to share. So we have to share with people, people have to share among themselves, and people have to interact with machines, every kind of machine. So what we have to do to share, you have to use standards in order to make the information accessible to everybody who needs it, and we will work on interoperability. So what do we mean by interoperability? Yes, it's the ability of two or more systems of components to exchange information and to use the information that has been exchanged. And it's also the capability to communicate, execute programs, or transfer data among various functional units in a manner that requires the user to have little or no knowledge of the unique characteristic of those units. So that's what we mean by interoperability, and to make everything interoperable, we need the standard, and that's why we are very active in standardization. So what is our theoretical background? So we think we all in our group, we think and we defend the double dimension of terminology. It means that the terminology has a linguistic dimension and it has also a conceptual dimension. When we work on the linguistic dimension, we of course work with discourses and text. When we work on the conceptual level, we have to deal with conceptualization, and the way that we represent the conceptual dimension is in maps most of the time. And when we talk about linguistic, most of the time it's written or oral text. So for us, terminology is the relation between linguistic and the concepts. If we only work in linguistics, well, most of the time we're working in lexicology or we are working in lexicography. When we work only in concept, so we are probably only working in knowledge engineering or eventually in epistemology. So what we want to do is to interact this both this dimension, and well, it's our most challenge is to make both interactive in our project. How do we do? Well, when we are working in this double dimension, so our starting point is discourses. We go from discourses to text. We try to identify and to work on the concept and on the linguistic systems. And when we go from the linguistic system, we go to the concept. We want to put the concept into a conceptual system, and the conceptual systems belongs to what we call knowledge. So in this conceptual dimension, we have concepts, and in the linguistic dimension, we have terms. And normally we work mainly with terms, and the terms are in text. And so texts are normally our object under observation. Okay, so in this theoretical point of view, when we have two different approaches. We have the semasiological approach. It means that our starting point is the linguistic dimension. We normally work with verbal communication, and we try to go from the verbal communication to the conceptual level. We try to identify and to find information that make us think that we have concepts behind. And we have the other approach is the onomasiological approach. We have our starting points are concepts, or the starting points are objects, and we try to find the words that are correct in order to talk about the world. So this double dimension, the difference between a semasiological approach and the onomasiological approach is always a discussion in our community. So what is our starting point? Do we begin with terms? Do we begin with concepts? And in our research group, we think that we need both of them, and the starting point depends on the project and what we want, in fact, to achieve. So, but the difference, this double dimension implies two different methods, okay? And when we begin to work, we have to decide what our methods are. So if you are in a semasiological approach, so we start from the form, meaning the words, and ask the following questions. What is the concept that is associated to the concept, okay? And what is the meaning of the word? So Adolf Steiner, so we are using the German terminology, bedeutung, Begriff. So it's very important to make this distinction, okay? So we have a word and we want to know what concept is behind that word. If you have an onomasiological approach, so in that case, we have the concept as a starting point, and then we have to check what is the designation and the denomination that the language has for the concept, okay? So this difference between Bezeichnung und Benennung, designation and denomination is, well, it's a question, it has in fact to do with the framework, because in fact, when we work with knowledge engineering, well, they have they see a difference between designation and the denomination. We are using Lyon's terminology, and so what we find in text are denominations, and we try to point to the object or to the concept that we consider not being in the text. So this is our dimension. So we have, when we have a linguistic dimension, we have a term. The term designates a concept, okay? And we consider that definition in natural language stabilizes the relation between the concept and the term that designates it. That's why in our work, definition is a very important element, because it's the text, in fact, that permit us to make the relation between the term and the concept that we are referring to. So if we go to our definition in ISO, a very recent definition that had been written in 2019, so you can find the representation of a concept by an expression that describes it and differentiates it from related concepts. So in 2000, we had another definition. So it was the representation of a concept by a descriptive statement, which serves to differentiate it from related concepts. So the difference between these two definitions, and I have to say I prefer the second one, is in fact expression. It's useful for linguists, because for us an expression is a linguistic expression, but people who work in formal definitions, they consider expression a logic expression, for instance. So it serves people who work in the linguistic dimension, and it serves people who works in the knowledge engineering, I mean, in the conceptual dimension. So this is the definition that we use normally when we work in terminology. So what we think, again, definition has a linguistic dimension, and it has also a conceptual dimension, okay? Not only a linguistic dimension. What is a concept for us? And this is very important, because in fact, for us, concept is a unit of knowledge created by unique combination of characteristics. And as we can see in note 1 and note 2, so it's very important that for us, concepts are not necessarily bound to particular natural languages, but of course, they are influenced by the social or cultural background, which often leads to different categorization. And on the other hand, the concept of concept, of course, as used and designated by the term concept in terminology work, it's the one that we are using. We are aware and we know that are very different concepts and that the disciplines are going to use very different definition of concept. So in our work, this is the definition of concept that we are using. So as we can see, so as we saw, so a concept has a linguistic dimension and it has an extra-linguistic dimension. In the extra-linguistic dimension, well, it can be represented by non-verbal expression. In the linguistic dimension, well, the concept is expressed by verbal expression, and this verbal expression normally represents textual conceptualization, and the textual conceptualization are not always the same as the conceptual representations. So what we have under what we observe in our group, since we are linguists, of course, we are concerned with verbal expressions. And when we talk about verbal expression, well, we are talking about concepts, we are talking about characteristics, we are talking about properties, and we can talk about relations, and we talk about two different kinds of relations, so lexical relation and conceptual relation. The only thing in our theory that is a term, well, a term is only a linguistic element that designates a concept. All the rest of this information that we can find in text, normally they are not terms, and they are linguistic items that we have to identify in order to know and to organize our conceptual level. Well, what is a term? Well, it's a designation that represents a general concept by linguistic means. And of course, we have a lot of examples like laser print, influenza A virus, and so on. So we have a lot of this kind of expressions. So a term has nothing to do with, in fact, a word formation, okay? So it means that we can have terms that may be partially or wholly verbal. Very quickly, and I know that this is this would be a slide mostly for linguistic people, but in fact, it's very important for us to know that a term is defined by its function. When I mean function, the first question that we ask is when we see a term, does the term designate a concept, yes or no? And if it designates a concept, okay, it's a term. If it's not a concept, well, it's something else. It can be very important, but it's not the term. And at the second level, we will see, well, if you have a term, how we are going to define it from a morphosynthetic point of view. And since terminologists are not always linguists, so it means that we have experts from a field, we have knowledge engineering, we have industry, we have all those who are interested in terminology, but are not interested in linguistics, okay? So we try to do is as simple as possible. And so we try to avoid the complexity of the term formation, and we make only the difference between what we call the monolexical units and what we call polylexical units. And we don't want to make the difference between a complex term or composed term, since it's very difficult in some languages to do the difference. And we consider every single word and every derivative, we consider this a monolexical unit. So that's the way we do when we work with terminologies. And so what do we consider? Well, a term is a monolexical unit, and it's a polylexical unit from a linguistic point of view, and it designates a term. So we are on the knowledge level, epistemology, what we call, and also what we call the Fachgebiete, so the domains where we are working with. So if we are a terminologist, well, to have this definition would be enough, okay? We would say verbal designation of a concept. But if you are a linguist, well, you need perhaps a little bit more, and we would say verbal designation of a concept. So we agree with terminology, and we will say whose structure may be monolexical or polylexical. So this information is important for us linguists. Very quickly, before I give the floor to Sara, so the way we are working in corpus building and processing, well, we have this we nowadays we use the sketch engine. We can use whatever is available. Sketch engine is for free in our university, for most of the university, until the end of the project. So it will be, so the Alexis project, it's the timeline is February 2022, and then we will see if it continues to be a free tool, or if it will be a paid tool. We hope it will still be free. And what do we have? Well, we use domain corpus compilation. So we spend a lot of time in organizing our corpus. We have corpus management, we have text mining, and then we go on to the analysis. And when we are at the level of the analysis, well, we in these two contexts, we have to go back all the time because we have results, they are not good enough, to have to refine the regex rules and so on. And then we go further on, and we go on to the examples, and Sara is going to tell us how we are going to operationalize all the elements that we just saw. Sara,
okay, thank you, Rute. So good morning, everyone, again. So we thought it would be interesting to bring a few examples of use cases and applications that we have recently gone through or are currently going through. So the first example is endotherm. So this was developed within the scope of my PhD research. And basically so we can move to the next slide. So basically, as an overview, so endotherm is knowledge-based terminological resources and the main focus was on a particular disease called endometriosis. And the aim was for the resource to have two modules, conceptual and linguistic, that might interrelate, and they do, following what Rute has mentioned, considering our theoretical framework. So the idea was that this resource could contribute to, as we mentioned earlier as well, a more effective way to represent, organize, but also share the current knowledge that concerns this disease, given that it's still a little bit underrepresented overall. So endotherm, in our view, would be the foundation, and it is already being the foundation of some terminological and or lexicographic resources related specifically to endometriosis. Also to the drafting of some materials. We will talk about health literacy also in another scope later on, but also aimed at different stakeholders, namely to expert patients. So this is a notion that was also developed here. So very briefly, an expert patient would be and is a patient that undergoes specific training, very often formal training concerning a particular disease, and therefore has the possibility to make a more active contribution in disseminating knowledge about that disease to non-expert audiences, together obviously and under the supervision of experts as well. An endotherm would also allow enriching biomedical resources in this particular domain. As I was saying, this is currently underrepresented. And by biomedical resources, I'm talking, for instance, about SNOMED-CT. So let's go to the next slide to see the framework. So here I have a representation of the conceptual framework of endotherm. So what we did first, so at the foundation of this framework, was to do a thorough overview of the existing biomedical resources like SNOMED-CT, as I mentioned before, but also the disease ontology, MESH, so medical subject headings, UMLS, bioportal, etc. And then as a use case, we decided to focus on procedures, so surgical procedures connected to endometriosis. And by that, we analyzed, detecting or identifying three axes of analysis. We decided to focus on the how axis, so on the surgical approach, and devise a core hierarchy for the ontology connected to the resource, focusing on the specific difference and Aristotelian-based approach, and we will see representation in the next slide. Then, to top that off, we added some non-hierarchical conceptual relationships because we thought that this would further enhance the conceptual power of the ontology, not just the hierarchical relations. And before translating it, so to speak, into a formal ontology or transitioning that, we decided to frame that into a categorical structure. So this is also an ISO standard. There's also an ISO standard for that, 1828. And here it's just an example of how, even at the semi-formal stage, we can prevent logical errors by using a categorical structure to frame our work. That would prevent us from saying that, for instance, laparoscopic hysterectomy, which is a type of procedure, could not be related to laparoscope through the relation has procedure site. So this is something that we did before actually going to the formal representation of the ontology. So in the next slide, we have a visual representation of the methodology we used. So for this particular project of endotherm, we actually, our starting point was the concept. So we acquired knowledge and systematized the knowledge existing in the subject field, again, mostly through these biomedical resources, which are currently already concept oriented. And then we devised the first draft of a semi-formal conceptual system. Semi-formal because this was not, it didn't have logical validation, and it was not created using a specific type of software that would allow operationalization of that conceptual system. So afterwards, however, that was a really useful foundation to underlie the processing and analysis of the corpus. So we used tools. Rute mentioned Sketch Engine. In this particular project, we used another tool called AntConc to process and analyze the corpus. And afterwards, from that, we created a set of lexical networks with the information we could extract from the corpus. Actually, these lexical networks were really helpful in the sense that they contributed to a new iteration of the conceptual system. So adding knowledge that was not there initially. And that helped, as I was saying, moving forward in the creation and validation of the formal ontology. We also thought it was interesting to explore another aspect, which is the contribution that formal concept definitions might have in the drafting of natural language definitions. So we explored the notion of definitional template that we tried then to apply to certain examples of the project. And then as regards knowledge sharing, we devised an approach that has some examples, as you can see there, maybe not very well, but on your right-hand side, a screenshot of Lexonomy, which is a software that we can use to share information with human users. And then on the left-hand side, we have a screenshot, and I will show you something a little bit bigger from another project of the OWL exporting file that allows interoperability with machines. So if we can go to the next slide. So here we have an example of some of the semi-formal maps that were created. So on the left-hand side, we have a snippet of the core hierarchy. And so we devised that in the surgical approach, there's the distinguishing, okay, yes, I can see it now. Also, it was also small for me. So we divided it through the degree of invasiveness by an invasive or minimally invasive surgical procedure, since all surgical procedures are to some extent invasive. So within the minimally invasive, we would have some which have a skin incision, others that have not already. And among those that have a skin incision, we might have some that only resort to a single skin incision or to multiple skin incisions. So just to contextualize, this initial hierarchy allowed us to then integrate the approach, the surgical approach information into the other approaches. So on the right-hand side, you see just an example of something that is the concept of laparoscopic single-site total hysterectomy. So it is basically, it inherits the characteristics of the parents, in this case, the total hysterectomy and the laparoscopic single-site hysterectomy. There were many more maps, but the time is short. So basically from the total hysterectomy, it inherits the direct procedure site, the method, and from the laparoscopic single-site hysterectomy, it inherits the access device and the approach that, again, you can pick up from the other graph, okay, that you see there. So let's move on. So in this particular project, just to sum it up, the focus was mostly on interoperability with terminological systems that already existed and with linked data. So this is obviously something that we are still exploring at the moment. Health literacy also, as I mentioned before, developing several resources for different end users with this framework in mind. And then this focus on the definitional templates. So this is very important for us in the sense that it allows us to optimize the drafting of these natural language definitions, making sure that, well, as much as possible, the essential characteristics of the concept are there. And this terminology of essential characteristic is part of the ISO standard that Rute described earlier. So let's check in the next slide, the second example. So now we're moving to something a little bit different. This is from Ontology Lab Med. So here you also have two references that specifically refer to this resource. Now, what is this? So in the next slide, we have an overview. This is something different. Ontology Lab Med is an ontology of domain labels that is focused on medicine. So this is within a very specific context of the collaboration of our research center with the Lisbon Academy of Sciences in the transition of their dictionary, Dicionário da Língua Portuguesa Contemporânea, into a digital version. So just to sum it up, what is the main issue? So the lexicographer basically assigns a certain label to a given domain. So this is a general language dictionary, but to each entry, there is a domain label that is assigned. And working with the experts, so with the lexicographers, they explained that the problem is the lack of consistency in the assignment of these domain labels. So we tried to help in this regard by using the standards to enable interoperability. So specifically, there's a standard related to lexicography called TILX0 that is being used. And again, the focus and the main goal is to improve the consistency in this assignment of domain labels. And the idea is also to contribute to more efficient information retrieval by the lexicographer, also by the end user, but mainly in the back office, so to speak, of the application. The lexicographer might have access to an advanced search by domain label as well. So the ontology was developed in OWL. It's available in the public repository. So let's now in the next slide check the framework. So here, again, we've talked about this. So interoperability is one of the key concepts in this example. And the notion of the semantic web stack that you have there on the right, where ontologies and OWL specifically are an important part as a way to disseminate knowledge in the semantic web. So let's perhaps more interestingly try to see the methodology that we used in the next slide. So what happened? Basically, the experts provided us with the taxonomy that existed for the dictionary. And then we analyzed it and together with them saw some inconsistencies and made an initial proposal that we then enhanced by analyzing other domain label resources like EuroSciVoc, for instance, ModSci, which is an ontology that refers to the different areas of knowledge. And then, of course, since the use case was on medicine, we also analyzed biomedical resources as well. We then created a top hierarchy where we also allowed polyhierarchy, since according to the experts, this was important. In the sense that, you know, the same label might, or there might be a label pertaining to two different domains. So that was important as well. We also added non-hierarchical relations to our ontology. And then, of course, we had an application scenario with the dictionary, in the sense that we try to integrate OWL with TILX0 using IRIs. So let's check the next slide to see a snippet of our work in Protégé. So this was the ontology application that we used. So basically this is just a screenshot showing how we did it and how we integrate our semi-formal representations into the system. Basically by introducing the logical constraints by using disjoint classes, etc., and thereby by reaching the formal definition of the concept. We also have in the screenshot on the top right, we have annotations, the annotation section of the editor. And in this case, one of the things we are currently working on is on this interaction between the linguistic and the conceptual part, namely through these annotation properties with our DFS label, adding the linguistic dimension, so multilingualism, as you can see there in different languages, the information for each label. But again, this is something that we have been working on, and we feel it still needs reflection and ongoing work with other standards like OntolX. So we can also move on to the next slide to see, again, on the left-hand side, a representation through the plugin, the Ontograph plugin of Protégé, of the core hierarchy, and then on the right we have again a snippet of the OWL file that we can use for the interoperability goal that we aim for. So in the next slide, we have, again, in a nutshell, the focus is on interoperability, and we use a few standards like OWL, TILX0, as I said, and we also used XLink to link OWL and TILX0. The application, it was to general language dictionaries, but as current and future work, we want to, and we also focused on medicine in this use case, but we are looking forward to expanding into other domains, to apply this approach to other metadata, not just domain labels, but to other types of labels, and see in the testing with the lexicographers how this aim of increasing consistency in domain labeling is indeed achieved, and this effective information retrieval if there are tweaks that we need to make or not. So we feel that these meta labels really can help us pave the way for interconnecting multilingual linguistic information. So in our next example, we have a current project that Rute mentioned called ComRehab. So this is basically something that was awarded the Santander Prize for the collaborative research, because we have in the team people from linguistics, but also from biomedical engineering, health literacy, etc. So as an overview, what is this about? Basically, the project aims to, as you can see there, contribute to the rehabilitation of post-COVID patients that are in hospitals, but also when they go home. So why? Well, to develop health literacy and the communicative skills of the various agents, not just the patients and their caretakers, but also healthcare professionals in this interaction that is always complex. Also literacy in terms of technological literacy in the use of these applications. And what we find interesting is that there is a use case being developed with virtual reality. So it is a rehabilitation program that is being developed and optimized based on a VR system. And where we come along is how we can interact with the patient better and more effectively. So let's check the next slide to see, first of all, sorry, the next slide, yes. So who is on the team? So you can see that besides us, Rute, Raquel, and myself, we have people from biomedical engineering, game design, health literacy, etc. So this is a very challenging and interesting project. So what's the framework? We are aiming for 3 modules. So for communication, sub-modules, in fact, one targeted at linguistic coaching, especially patient-oriented communication. The other one, we want to get patient feedback and improve the interaction with the platform, and then design a tutorial for current and future users. So this integrates with VR for NeuroPain, which is the virtual reality platform that has also been developed by our colleagues in biomedical engineering. So moving on to the next slide. So here are the sub-modules in more depth. So I'll just highlight a few things from each one of the sub-modules. In the first one, as I said, the idea is to help the therapist and or informal caregiver in the sessions themselves. So by helping people to become progressively more autonomous, Autonomous in the use of the technology. We are not interfering, obviously, in the therapy itself, but autonomous also in the communication interface. So how they will interact with the technology, not only by listening to the therapist conducting the exercises, but also by making a contribution from our end in getting clear and explicit voice instructions. Then in the second submodule, we are collecting the patient's opinion about his or her experience. What were the main difficulties when using the system? How can the communication interface area be improved, etc. This is also obviously crucial for us to improve the interface. And finally, the design of a tutorial, both for the patient and for the informal caregiver, because as we know, in some very serious cases of post-COVID rehabilitation, it is not the patient himself or herself that interacts with the technology, but the caregiver. So this tutorial, we are aiming to integrate not only verbal, well, textual information, but also video formatting with oral explanations in, well, in this case for now in European Portuguese, but with subtitles in European Portuguese, Brazilian Portuguese, and English. And the goal is to incorporate sign language if we can within the project. So again, in this case, the focus is more on health literacy, human-machine interaction, engaging the patient. We find this also is also in line with current research in health literacy. And ontologies will also be used in this specific project. We are devising an ontology related to, well, things like, with the help of the experts, anatomy, for instance, and also some instructions that are in line with existing electronic health records, biomedical systems. And then we will see where we are at the end of the project and if we can expand into other pathologies or medical specialties. Finally, the last example, also within health literacy, is regards the work that Raquel is doing within the Collab. So as you know, the pandemic generated a need for more efficiency and efficacy in healthcare communication. And within our research group, we, as we mentioned before, aim to answer these problems, these challenges, by creating terminological resources that are oriented also towards the patient or the citizen in general. So on your left-hand side, you see a screenshot of our COVID-19 glossary that we have been developing, which contains popularized definitions that everybody can understand. So using language that is accessible to the overall citizen. On your right-hand side, top right-hand side, we have also a project that Raquel is participating in. So in the sense that, so to help the patients to better understand their disease and be more autonomous, there's a guide that is being created for home recovery and using most of all simplified language. So the video is recorded of the patient testimony and the idea is to, again, focus on the patient and on his or her empowerment and active role in contributing to their own healthcare and their own situation. Finally, also on the right-hand side, but bottom-hand side, is a glossary that Raquel is developing of serological test terms, because citizens were, well, there was feedback that citizens weren't really understanding their test results from serological test platforms. And so Raquel, within the Collab setting, is developing this glossary to respond to this challenge. So I think we can move on to the concluding remarks. In this talk, we hope that it was clear that we agree that there's added value in this synergy involving terminology and its double dimension that Rute explained with ontologies. So on the one hand, specialized texts provide access to the expert community and are also a vehicle for knowledge stabilization. But ontologies, on the other hand, provide the potential for operationalizing the concept systems and for interoperability that we addressed in the several examples. Also in the next slide, we have a few other key points. So some challenges, but also opportunities that, that we have been addressing in our projects. So again, as good practice, ontologies should be reused for different projects. So we are trying to do that. It is not always easy, but using the standards has helped. So that's why we are trying to use and interconnect several standards like OWLT, ILEX0, ONTOLEX, and also in this particular case of healthcare, connecting with biomedical terminological systems like SNOMED-CT, ICD-11, MESH, etc. We believe there's a lot of potential as regards information retrieval. So this aim for logical consistency is obviously our guiding force as well in the projects. We also believe that different examples that we have shown are open for expansion into other domains, other resources, other languages, because for us, multilingual content, as linguists that the three of us are by training, is perhaps our most important endeavor. And the interaction with the experts, so that we can further personalize results according to the end user, is really, really key, because we do have methodological frameworks and theoretical that Rute explained, but overall, and she mentioned that as well, we need to bear in mind the needs of each project, and especially of the end users, to then further refine how we can reach those results more effectively. And I think that's all. So we'd like to thank you for your attention, and we are now available for the questions. Thanks.
Thank you, Sara, Raquel, and Rute for this interesting presentation, for letting us know more about your work. The room is open for questions. I can see I have already some raised digital hands. So please, if you want to make a question, raise your digital hand. If you cannot for any reason, raise your actual hand or send me a message. So a first question, I think Eric.
Yeah, thanks a lot for this overview. Obviously, you're doing lots of research in many different projects. I have a question. So we can't talk about details here, but I have a question about the foundational assumptions in the beginning of the talk. So, okay, so terms designate concepts. So the first question, okay, I try to pack them into one. I'll try to be brief. So the first question is, how do you know which concept a term designates, and how do you know that you have the kind of the right description of the context? That translates to, how do you know that you have the right ontology? I suppose the experts, the domain experts, come into play here. And then I was wondering more generally, what kind of relations do you allow between nodes in these graphs? Is this arbitrary, decided by the project, or is it this taken from the standards? And also, how do you deal with, I think that's probably most important, how do you deal with uncertainty, uncertain information? Because that's everywhere in at least in most applications. So it should be somewhere in the ontology, and especially, and it's very easy to draw the wrong inferences depending on how you represent that. It's very tricky to get this right. So basically, the question is about the ontologies, whether you can explain a little bit more about these.
Okay, Sara, when it comes up to ontologies, I give you the floor. Concerning the terms, well, the question you are asking is in fact behind all the methods that we are using in terminology, okay? The first thing is, well, it depends if your approach is onomasiological or if your approach is semasiological. Let's think about the semasiological point of view. So we know we have what we call candidate terms. That's the terminology that we are using. So when we are looking into a text, we know by the term formation that element, that linguistic element, may be a term. Okay, so we have a list of these terms which check with experts. So experts are always in our method. We have no project without experts, okay? So we try to have a group of experts. So we want to have at least 3 experts because they themselves don't agree on the concept level. Okay, so there is a big discussion normally going on the discussion levels, on the concept level. So we try to identify. When we have a term, we say, do you agree that this designates a concept? Let's say everybody says yes. And then we try to identify the essential characteristics of the concepts. Okay, we go into the level of the concept and we try to identify the characteristics. When it comes up to the characteristics, well, they are normally, what happens is that we normally have a core of characteristics where people agree, and then you have a bunch of them where people don't agree. Okay, so when we have those that we agree, we try to write a definition. Well, it depends. If we work alone as linguists, we try to have a definition that is written in natural language. If we work with engineers, so with knowledge engineering, well, we try to have the relation between a formal definition and a natural language definition. That's what we did, for instance, when we work in a project for our INE, for our statistics body. So we try to find the equilibrium, so the balance. The balance. Yes, the balance between the formal definition and the natural and the language definition. So it means that sometimes you have a definition, a formal definition, and we say, well, one of those definitions are wrong, or the formalization is wrong, or the language level is wrong. And we try to have a definition that is okay for all of us. And when I mean for all of us, it means that we don't have the best definition. We have the definition that is possible at that moment for that purpose. Okay, because when we go back 2 months later or 3 months later to the definition, well, most of the time it's possible to improve the definition. Okay, so it's a very constructive way of working, and we are not always absolutely happy with the results. What we try to achieve in all the cases is that there are no mistakes in the definition. So it's good when we have no mistakes, but we have we try to come up with a definition that is acceptable for that purpose. Okay, so most of terminologists don't believe in universal definitions. Okay,
you're defining. You're not, for instance, using something like prototype theory, talking about the nearness of to a stereotypical example or something like that, or.
Well, in the standards, we normally try to do that. Okay, so if you take a look in the standard 704, we're now trying to have, for 20 years, we are having the discussion to find a prototypical example, and it's very difficult because we have to agree on the prototype example that it's true for China, for Portugal, for South Africa, and so on. So we try, but it's not always possible. Let's say. I don't know if I answered your question, Eric.
Yeah, you did. Just uncertain information. If you can quickly.
Yeah. So about the type of relations, I think that was also asked as well. So again, given the scope of each project and the experts involved in the project, they play the biggest role in helping us set up which relations are important. So maybe for some projects, only hierarchical relations matter. And if that's the case, then let's go for it. If they believe that non-hierarchical relations also make a point, okay. In the healthcare area, we do tend to, again, because of the importance of the standards, and if this is important for the project in terms of future interoperability, we have to, I mean, the experts, most of them know these types of software as well. in terms of standard information. So we also try to establish a connection with that and say, okay, is that important for you? Would you like to integrate that information into the system, etc.? So this is key, because otherwise, as you said, and well, we can basically conceptualize anything and put the wrong information into an editor like Protégé, and the reasoner works even if the reasoning is wrong, the underlying reasoning, I mean. So about uncertainty, well, as Rute answered that to some extent, in the sense that, you know, it's difficult sometimes to reach something that is 100% certain, even among the same group of experts that we work with. And that is why she mentioned that we try as much as possible to work with an odd number of experts. And to some extent, there's also some certain, as far as we can say it, a degree of intersubjectivity among communities of practice too. So we try to represent that also with our collaboration, which is crucial, but there's always a certain degree of intersubjectivity. Yes. So I hope that added something else to the answer that Rute gave. Thanks for the question.
Thank you, Florian. Next.
Yes, thank you, Dima. My question goes in a very similar direction as Eric's, and so I take the opportunity to press you a little bit more on that. So when you're talking about designation of concepts, then, and as I understand Eric, then there seems to be a problem about how to ostensibly define certain concepts, right? I mean, you had examples on one slide and it was very fast, so I only grasped one. It was like 3/4 of an hour. Was that an example? And I wondered, how do you define that concept ostensively, and other concepts as well, colors, number words, demonstratives, verbs. So how are you defining them ostensively? You said to Eric as an answer, yeah, let's assume that everybody says yes and that there is a kind of discussion about that. But the disagreement on the defining of those concepts already presupposes knowledge about what the concepts are and how they are designated, right? So I'm wondering how that works out in the end. Thanks.
Thank you for the question. So I'm only able to give you answers to the project that we are working on. So I did not work with colors or with other elements. So because every time we go into a new project, well, we take some time, normally 6-8 months. That's the time we take to see how we can, how can we respond to the needs of the community, okay? And as we can see, every community has very different needs. And so it means also that for every project, we need to have different series behind them, okay? So what we work on right now, it's medical, it's health, it's cork mainly, and it's archaeology, so it's objects. So I don't know how I would deal with colors or how I would deal with other elements. So it would mean in any case, and I can tell you that we work in statistics for our Instituto Nacional de Estatística here in Portugal. Well, and for instance, we took quite a long time to understand what they mean by variable, for instance, okay? So each concept, when we go into each concept, and that's why we need to work with experts, they have an understanding of the concepts, okay? We don't have an understanding of the concept when we begin. So what we have as terminologies, we have methods, okay? That's why, and I see some of my colleagues in attending. So all of us at some point, it's absolutely new for us. So, and as I normally say, well, terminologists are very good in asking stupid questions, okay? Because when we go into a new group, we ask them for very simple and basic questions. And most of the experts tell us, well, we never had to explain that because it's so obvious for us, okay? And there's the moment where when they begin to understand what we need and how they have to put in an explicit way what they know in an implicit way, there is where the discussion for us is very interesting. So when we look at the designation, for us it's a candidate, because from a linguistic point of view, it could be a term, but we don't know if there is a concept behind or not. Okay, so it means that you have methods. We have methods to evaluate and to ask people for questions in order to give them the floor and to let us know if yes, it's a term, or no, it's not a term. And most of the time it has to do with the characteristics of the concepts. I don't know, Sara.
Can I just, yes, I just like to add something, that just to say that we showed these semi-formal representations that we use very often in the interaction with the expert, just because it is our experience that in some areas it's easier for the experts to resort to some sort of visual representation to try to make explicit what is implicit, and using these semi-formal representations. At the same time, for us, it's the meetings with the experts, especially in this project, in these healthcare projects, need to be very well, the time needs to be very well spent since availability is very limited. So everything that helps in a quick visualization of, okay, as following our previous meeting, we try to make explicit to you these characteristics of the concept that you try to represent here. You did not grasp this. Actually, this relation is missing. And so we then go back. So it's an iterative process, but very challenging one, but very interesting, as Rute said.
I don't know, Florian, if you.
Okay, oh, thank you. That was very informative. Thank you.
Thank you, Florian.
Next is Rosalie.
Hello, Rute, Sara. Just one question. It was very interesting, your talks. Yeah, and I'd like to know about the criteria. What are the criteria that you have, that you use to choose between, for instance, between semasiology and onomasiology for the analysis you do? I didn't understand. Because Rute, you talked at the beginning about two methods, but what kind of method you use? And I don't know, it depends on the professional area, it depends on the client, I don't know, just to know about that. Thank you.
Yes, it depends on both. I mean, it depends on, the first question is, when we have a project, and when someone asks us to organize terminology, for instance, okay? So it depends on the subject field. One thing is you have law, one thing is you have archaeology, okay? So it means the corpus, and for us the corpus is the elements that you can observe are very different from topic to topic, okay? So if you work in a museum, perhaps they want to organize objects. So we will have the object. So that's a little bit what we did, for instance, with Bruno. So he worked on archaeology. So we have the objects, and we do, well, The idea is, so what is the difference between an object A and an object B? And so you can observe the objects and you can decide afterwards how to designate these objects, okay? Because in the community, they have some problems in designating the object, for instance, okay? So the idea, well, you take a look at it, we identify the characteristics of the object, and then we will see how do we call this, how do we name this, and how do we talk about this in another language, for instance. That would be an onomasiological point of view. Another thing is, well, when we have only texts, we don't have the objects, we don't have the, in the first place, we don't have the experts, okay? We only have text. For instance, when we work for Corpus, so we only had text at the first place. The experts came in later on.
Okay.
So it means it depends on the constitution of the group. It depends on the aim of the group. What do you want to have? You want to, what is the aim? To organize the object, or is, for instance, the translation world? Translation world wants to know how they translate a subject field in another language. Okay, so they are less concerned with knowledge organization. They are more concerned with linguistic questions. If you have, for instance, if you work with a minority language, for instance, we work sometimes with Bantu language in Africa. So what they want to have is to have the right term in a Bantu language. Okay, so the aim is not to organize the knowledge, but it's to know how to call that object in. So it means that in any case, in both cases, we always have a semasiological and a non-nomasiological approach, but in some domains, text is more important than object, and in other domains, objects are more important than and as you know, we worked also with dance, contemporary dance, and at some point we have the movements, but we don't have the word to call the movements, to name the movements, okay? So again, each domain has a particular approach, and that's why terminology is so exciting, because every domain has different challenges, and in fact, the way you approach the domain is always different from a domain to another one. That's why, in my teaching, I normally try to give people the three approaches: only semasiological approach, only onomasiological approach, and mostly both approaches, okay? But when we have both approaches, normally it means that one of the approaches is more relevant than the other one. But we need, most of the time, we need both.
Thank you. Thank you, Rute.
Thank you. Obrigada, Carvalho.
So next is Maria Gracia.
Thank you for your talk. I have a clarification question on the concept of validation that you referred to, because I imagine that this is an important concept both for the interoperability but also to the dissemination of the ontologies you create for the general public. So I'd like to know more about how this validation process works, and also perhaps if I'm curious to know if and how do you do to assess the efficacy of the ontologies you create for people. So I mean the impact that the translation you do can have on their health literacy, on their understanding of an issue. Thank you.
Thank you. So for validation, perhaps I would give to Raquel the floor for validation, but well, she has to talk in Portuguese or in French So Raquel, because English is not good enough. So Raquel, would you like to, would it be better in Portuguese or in French for most of you?
Portuguese is better.
Okay, it's better, okay. Raquel, pergunta como funciona a validação.
Sim. Perdão. Em termos de validação, nós trabalhamos sempre, como já foi referido, com um grupo de especialistas, não é? Em todos os projetos. Os linguistas, terminólogos que nós somos, que estamos envolvidos no projeto desde o seu início até ao seu fim, temos também por metodologia a criação da própria metodologia de validação. Em função, como já foi explicado, o objetivo do nosso trabalho, não é? Da sua aplicabilidade, vamos constituir então um grupo de especialistas que vai acompanhar o projeto. Vamos, como terminólogos, fazer todo o trabalho que a Rute e a Sara explicaram de identificação da terminologia dos candidatos a termos. Vamos propor uma metodologia que seja eficaz na validação, no sentido em que constituímos listas dos candidatos a termos, submetemos individualmente a cada elemento do painel de especialistas essa lista de candidatos a termos, recolhemos as listas dando orientações muito concretas para o que é que nós entendemos por sim, é um termo, não é um termo ou não é nada, não é relevante para este projeto. Numa outra fase, então, analisamos esse levantamento de opiniões dos especialistas, recolhemos, sintetizamos e, na verdade, quando é possível, e enfim, esperemos que no futuro volte a ser possível, reunimos presencialmente com o grupo de especialistas para esclarecer as dúvidas, porque, como já foi dito aqui, o conhecimento não é consensual, não é? Cada especialista pode haver um grupo, num painel de especialistas, pode haver, e há sempre, visões diferentes dentro da própria especialidade. E, portanto, precisamos de confrontar especialistas sobre o seu próprio conhecimento no sentido construtivo e de chegar nunca a nada que se assemelhe ao universal, mas ao consensual. Portanto, por isso nós assumimos nesta tarefa, nós terminólogos, como mediadores, somos mediadores para chegar a um consenso entre especialistas. E, portanto, é uma metodologia baseada na conversa, na comunicação com eles. Eu não sei se a pergunta não foi mais dirigida, não sei se entendi bem, mas à validação da própria ontologia. E eu passo a palavra à Sara.
Well, I'll switch to English then. So as regards the validation of ontologies, there are several methods already disseminated in the literature. We, for instance, we like what has been devised by the NEON project. I'm sure some of you are aware of the project. So this is a project that devises different scenarios for the creation of ontologies and also methodology to validate the ontology per se. So naturally the experts are also involved there, but from a technological standpoint, we use the validation methodology and the scenarios put forward by the NEON project. Now, we also have competency questions at the beginning when we devise the ontology, also following good practice. But just to clarify, Maria Grazia, so the ontologies are not developed for the human end user, so directly. So they are devised to be the background of a product that will then be presented to the end user. Yes, so I hope that was clear. Thank you. Rute, you are muted.
Yes, Maria Grazia, right now. So none of our project is at the end, okay? So at some point we are going, and it's true for ComRehab, for instance, we are implementing now the validation, and we are building an inquiry with a specific question to ask people if it's clear, if they can use it, if it's what is, in fact, to have their opinion And we are working on this inquiries in order to go back and to take into account some elements that are not transparent to the end user. Okay, because when we 10 years ago, perhaps 20 years ago, when we worked with translation, machine translation. So there was always a validation group. Okay, we had to have that validation group in order to improve the system. Okay, so every year you have to have a validation group. You ask for questions, people reply, and then you have to go back and you have to re-implement some of the issues that have been appointed as less interesting or less good or less appropriate or not understandable at all by someone. Maria Grazia, I don't know if...
Thank you.
Thank you, Maria Grazia.
I actually have a small follow-up on that because so the logical validation, just to understand, because I'm still missing something there. So it's a validation of the concepts between the different experts. Is it exactly that? If you can give us an example maybe of, because I understood we're talking here about some logical relations that are being validated. So if you maybe can give us an example of of that.
Well, of course, actually, this is the core team that we have. So as part of the core team, we have people also with training in logic, like Bruno, okay, Bruno Almeida, our colleague Bruno Almeida. So the experts so what they do is they validate the concepts that are going to be included. We have this initial stage of defining what type of relations are important for that specific application. From a logical standpoint, we fortunately have expertise also, but we are always open again for collaborations, and that's how the team has been growing and developing. But we have some expertise in logic also for this validation. We have had collaboration also from people in computer science, knowledge engineering, artificial intelligence. And so, yeah, so basically what we do is this validation happens. There's a representation also in the ontology editors. And then it's the iterative process that I was talking about. So there may be changes to the conceptualization that are needed. So even after the experts have validated things, if we can, ideally, the scenario is to have everybody on board at the same stage. So in the sense that, okay, there's always an initial stage where the experts would agree to some extent. So there was consensus already being referred to by both Rute and Raquel and also by myself. So the experts agree on a consensus to a specific set of concepts that are going to be defined. So with their particular relations, at least what they believe is important for the product. And then there's the work from us in terminology, but with expertise in logic also and in computer science to see from how from a technological standpoint, things might be represented, okay? And afterwards, we may go back to the experts from an ontological perspective in some areas. They may bring some value, but there are some things that they may not be aware of from a logical standpoint or a computer science standpoint. So that's why we need this, this team that is rich in expertise and multidisciplinary.
Okay, I leave the room. Next, we have Martin and Pedro.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, hi, thank you. This is extremely interesting and relevant. So I have a question that in a certain way is a follow-up to all the previous questions and also to what Raquel was saying. So it touches upon ontologies and concrete examples. So with Pedro, who will ask a question next, we just completed a paper on the conceptual discussions over what counts as a COVID-19 death. So I didn't see it in your slide, but this is a fascinating. So I've used that example, okay, and then what happens here is there is, in the first place, and that was question of Eric and also Maria Grazia, I believe, there is, and response of Raquel, there is certain scientific underdetermination. I mean, which people died, you know, of COVID and which died with COVID. And I will not go into details, but there is the whole, you know, comorbidities and all kinds of interesting things. And then testing and autopsies and all this is very uncertain. So the scientific ontology, as it were, is open. We don't know. Then enters the, and also with Planet, another example, uses famous example in this all. Then enters the what we call with Pedro the institutional ontology. So there is WHO, the OMS, and obviously there is the International Classification of Diseases, and they step in and they say, well, okay, what are we going to do about it? And they did that last April, so 2 years into pandemic, 2 months into pandemic. They said, all right, so what should be on the death certificate should be any confirmed or suspected case. And then they say, well, we know this might not be exactly the scientific result, but for statistic purposes, so you mentioned also repeatedly your work with statistic office here in Portugal, they said, well, it's okay to have the suspected deaths, okay? And then, you know, and then in the UK, there was the British ENET, the ONS, the Office of National Statistics, having an argument with their own government, and they said, okay, because the government said only people with confirmed tests within 28 days who died in a hospital are COVID-19 deaths, and that's the official British numbers. Then they changed it. They changed the hospital regulation in August. ONS said anybody who died following basically the WHO account. So there's two different numbers. And there is a huge disparity between them. So, so here my question is, so there, and each of them, you know, there are very reasonable semantic arguments. So there is a disagreement among experts. There are very interesting semantic arguments, some of them pointing to scientific accuracy, others to public utility and kind of more functional benefits of a certain concept. Yeah, and so what do you do in these cases? I mean, there is an open debate, and I'm not talking about the crazy open debate that climate change, I don't know, with some wacko guys. It is an open debate that needs to be closed by whatever, DGS or someone. What do you do? What would you do in this kind of cases? And the kind of cases that for us who are philosophers of language are most interesting are exactly the open cases. There is again, Planet is a famous case. There is a marriage, is gay marriage, you know, and our horses, athletes, these are the kind of interesting cases that we are fascinated with. What would you do in this case in your project, for example, with this COVID-19 death? Who would you take? Which ontology would you follow? Whose ontology?
Rute, can you start?
Super long question, but sorry, I just
could you please start, and I'll just find a slide from another example that is not COVID related, but that can bring also some few more things to the table.
Well, again, the examples that you are giving are not the aim of our ontologies. I do understand the interest in what you are saying. From what you mentioned, what is important for us is, in fact, when we compile our corpus, okay, we have to decide which discourses and which kind of texts we are going to retain to do our ontology that has a specific purpose behind it, okay? So our purpose was not to have the discussion that you are talking about, which is a very interesting one, but we would not make an ontology as only as an intellectual exercise. So normally we do an ontology because we want to resolve a problem, okay? And in fact, the problem you are right now identifying is not one of our problems, let's say, okay? what you are talking about, what would be interesting for me as a linguist, and we are working a little bit on this, is in fact, what you are talking about is also a question of word formation, of term formation, and the question also of the difference between terms and collocations, that it's a problem that you have in our terminology, okay? Because we have collocations, and some of the examples you gave us for us collocation, they don't designate specific concepts, but they allow us to elaborate discourses about concepts, okay? So what we find in text from a linguistic point of view is very, very, very rich, but what we try to identify is in fact the concepts that permit you to elaborate the discourses. Okay.
I understand it, but I want to avoid this kind of accusation. Sorry, this is the Philosophy Institute, but of the intellectual exercise. As a common citizen, the most crucial thing is I want to know how dangerous COVID is, how many people died in Portugal with COVID, and then the discussion, you open a certain kind of worms, because the way we count who died as COVID is very different in different countries. And it's a super important terminological issue for a common citizen. And depending how you count, in Britain, you have 100,000 people dying or 85. There's 15,000 people who died or didn't. And that concerns me as a citizen to know what exactly is happening. I mean, is people who is in a terminal stages of cancer and dies with COVID, why do we count this person of dying with COVID? Yeah, sorry, this is not a nice thing to discuss, but the person would have died anyway in a month or two, probably. So this is an important public thing, and I'm wondering if your kind of dictionary of these COVID terms that are super important, I think, for all of us, about different types of tests, and that's what you showed. What would you do with this, for example? So I understand that you have different purposes, but would you just assume that the definition of the DGS or ENA is correct and say, okay, that's fine?
It's not saying it's correct or wrong. When we propose a definition, we give the source, okay, and we would eventually have 2 or 3 or 4 different sources, and different definitions, for instance, okay, and you can find them. But what we would do is, in the context of our project, we would the experts would probably assume one. They would, as a group, assume one definition, okay? And we, as a linguist, we would not say it's the best one, it's a good one. We would say this is the definition given by the institution X, okay? And we have always, and we have notes, and we have, in fact, what we try to achieve in our popularization is to permit people who wants to go into the debate that there are sources that could help them to go into that discussion.
Okay.
As linguists, we don't, or as terminologists, we don't assume, in any case, as since we are not domain experts, don't assume the definition as being the best or the only one, okay?
Okay.
That's why the definition, what we do most of the times is we rewrite the definitions, okay? Because experts most of the time have some, well, I don't want to say they don't know how to write the definition. They write it's not correct. It's not what I mean. But it's the right definition in accordance to their needs. Let's say like that. When we step from text into dictionaries or into databases, well, we have to rewrite the information. Okay, and what we do is we pick 2 references. Okay, we say the definition is partially good. The definition is partially good. we propose a new one, and we give the sources. But every information that we have in our database had been validated by domain experts.
Okay. Okay, so this is what Raquel was mentioning, that this idea of mediating. So you would really try to strike a certain.
Yes.
Yes,
okay, exactly.
Sorry.
No, it's
sorry, Sara.
Yeah, about the conceptual dimension. So in the COVID-19 project that was mentioned of the glossary, ontologies have not been implemented, so they're not being developed for that specific purpose. But the discussion that you have just put forward is really interesting, also because it is true, it has real implications in the way the information is disseminated because of the statistical issues. I don't know how to answer the question in the sense that what do you do when two specialized bodies disagree on the definition of a given concept? Because
and this happened exactly. This is the kind of type of work that we've been analyzing, also the discourse and the arguments they give, and they are fascinating because each of them has good arguments.
Yes.
For the British government, they say it's fastest, it's scientifically proven because they have positive tests, and the ONS says no, but they don't really, because there are many people who are not tested. What do we do about that?
Can I just add, Marcin, that this also has political implications, of course, because again, this goes way beyond.
The country is on the green list, or it isn't, and you lose millions of euros.
Can I just, if you allow me, I would just like to share one slide just to show. I think you can see it now. So just to show something completely different, but from not related to COVID, but something that we found in another study. For example, in this idea, so this notion of single port laparoscopic surgery. So the experts provided, with things like, okay, single incision, single access to the body. But then in the literature, you find, on the left, you have a table of some of the candidate terms that we extracted from the corpus. And these are all considered in the literature and very often mentioned in the corpus. Some synonyms include, or also known as, and then you have this whole list of things that, it's questionable from a conceptual standpoint if all these terms, if they are considered as such, would designate the same concept. Because in some of them, as you can see, this idea of incision is not there. And so, this is a classic example of proliferation of designations in the literature, in the scientific literature. And that what we found interesting was that the experts themselves decided, okay, it's time to stop this. So they created a consortium, okay, of experts. And then what we found interesting is that they started actually with the conceptual approach. So, and you see there a quote from the white paper that was produced from that consortium. So it's interesting. They said, okay, we believe this should have the following, in this case, characteristics, right? And so you have a list, and then they say, well, to encompass this from a linguistic standpoint, we believe that this term so-and-so is the one that most accurately conveys what we want.
Okay, so this is beautiful because this is very similar to what happened with the planet definition of planet, when they started thinking Pluto is a planet, and then they had all these discussions in the scientific meetings, and
So sorry, but it doesn't have, it's not related directly to our talk.
Okay, but thank you. I really appreciate that you explained that. So thank you so much. Thank you.
No problem. And thank you. It's a fascinating discussion, and especially in healthcare, there is this whole practical side of statistical numbers. Yes.
Exactly. Thank you.
Okay. Next is Pedro.
Hi. So thank you a lot for the presentation, and so it's very nice, very interesting, and thank you for being willing to engage in conversation with us. So I'm just trying to get insight, or to get into what you're doing, or to understand it better. And I think I will inevitably repeat some of the topics and also a lot of what Martin has said. So I think my point is, I think I identify some sort of tension. On the one hand, you have these definitions that you have been presented as, on the one hand, purpose related, but also revisable. So when you return to them after 2 or 3 months, you might have to add some new elements. And purpose related, I mean, if you arrive at it from a certain angle or using as data a certain corpus, you arrive at a certain definition, or you arrive at a different one if you take some other things into consideration. You also talked about the creativity in the whole exercise. So you're watching a number of dance moves, and you're trying to figure out how to come up with the right terms to make sense, to classify what you have in front of you. So these would be in one in one of the plates. On the other hand, you have definitely the intention, the willingness to get to some sort of uniformity. So you have this, I mean, the idea of an ontology would be, if I minimally understand it, would be to have a unified representation of knowledge about some topic. Also, I think within the very idea of, how do you call it? Interoperationality, something like this, right?
Interoperability.
Okay, that's it. To get that, I mean, you have to be talking about the same thing. And I have to say, I'm not complete. I mean, I know I know, or I think I know, I imagine it's terribly difficult to deal with these kind of things concretely, to offer some concrete solution to them. But I'm not completely convinced with the idea that on the one hand, you try to come up with a uniform, with a, you try to converge on a certain definition, but at the same time, you keep track of all the different sources where you have like this qualification. Well, this is the definition we arrived at, but pay attention that these people are talking about this in a different way. These other people are talking about this in a different way. Of lately, there are these panel of experts that met and decided, now this is how we should talk about it. So in the end, you still, how do you reconcile the huge information source and all these different sources, and the need to arrive at some sort of operational single definition? I mean, I feel this tension, and I'm not even sure if it's fair to ask you, how do you deal with this? But do you have any thoughts on that? Also, because just a final remark, also because it's very clear that you're paying a lot of attention to questions of consistency. So you've talked about it a lot of various times. So how do you? It's just an invitation for you to comment. Oh, thank you.
Sara, do you want to? Or?
Well, so I can say a few words. Thanks for your question, Pedro. So it is. I think that accurately depicts our day-to-day challenges. So dilemmas sometimes, because on the one hand, we are indeed trying to convey some consistency into the process, and of course methodological concerns being transmitted. But on the other hand, we are dealing with perhaps one of the most inconsistent things we have, which is language. And so to play in both these fields is not easy, especially depending on the communities we work with. So in some communities and for some experts, consistency is a big deal, and very often that's why they contact us, because they have identified a consistency problem for example, in terms of communication with their end users, and they want to try to solve that. But for other communities, something else may be more important, like providing a resource a terminological resource, but not really being too picky, let's say, on the details of consistency, so that they leave that to us, so to speak. So yeah, it's really, again, it is hard, so it is difficult. We've talked about this difficulty of, on the one hand, texts providing, so being the natural habitat of terms, but at the same time, there's a lot of things that are not said explicitly in texts. So if they are written by experts to, even to a non-expert audience, some of the things related to subject field knowledge may not be explicitly mentioned, because they may assume that the people already have that knowledge, which is not necessarily the case, and not always the case. So texts per se. So that's why we have, I'm also, reflecting together with you, which is, answering your open invitation. So thanks for that. So on the one hand, we use methodologies to explore text in a systematic way, okay, and to extract as much information as we can in a systematic way, but being aware that texts do not contain the whole information, so all of it. Our pathway through ontologies is something that is not unique to us. So it's been a trend that has been going on for, we would say that the last 2 or 3 decades, especially. What sometimes, what some other groups try to do, which is also reasonable, of course, is, for example, to try to extract ontologies directly from texts, which is something that we have our reservations about. Okay, so given that what I've just mentioned, that texts are incomplete products per se, and inconsistent very often. So we have tried to combine these 2 approaches the most systematic way we can and the most logical way we can. How? By defining methodologies, by defining quality starting point, both in the text and by asking experts also to provide feedback. Very often we do that on which texts they consider to be the most representative of their areas. On the other hand, by providing the logical consistency, the one that is possible with ontologies. So integrating in this multidisciplinary setting. However, I agree that this tension, you called it tension, is there, okay? Is there in the sense that sometimes not even the experts agree on the conceptual level even of what something is. So as in our mediation work mentioned by Raquel, we try to, again, as much as possible, and I wrote down the verb that you use because that's what we try to do, is to reconcile things. But by trying, our main concern is to provide terminological resources that have quality from a linguistic standpoint, so that allow communication to be more effective from a linguistic standpoint. We convey, or we try to integrate the conceptual dimension and the interoperability provided by the ontologies as a way to bring that extra consistency, for instance, in the drafting of natural language definitions, let's say. So we thought that, that could bring some potential to the table, given that if there's some sort of, calling it template is a little bit, it's going too far perhaps, but if we aim to define something in natural language, and if we have in the background logical reasoning, and which may be operationalized through an ontology, but not necessarily. So if we have some logical reasoning behind it, trying to define the characteristics of that concept in a systematic way, the person drafting the definitions, and Raquel has a lot of experience in that, can in a more efficient way transfer this logical knowledge into the natural language definition, as much as possible. So so consistency is also, in our view, important in this regard. So one of the key aspects of the products that we try to provide are definitions. And definitions, many of them, as Rute mentioned, have issues. They are circular, they are more descriptions than definitions. So we try to integrate, reconcile, as you mentioned, these dimensions. It is not always easy, but in the use of some systematic methodology and you know, theoretical background, we try to do that as much as we can. Rute, I think you were about to say something.
Yes, no, only to say yes, there is a tension, okay, even inside the community.
Mm-hmm.
On one hand, you have linguists, on the other hand, you have knowledge engineer. So there is a tension between these two groups when we work together, and the discussion is very. We have a lot of discussion concerning this question. The other element that you referred about interoperability, Pedro, what makes things what makes interoperability possible is in fact the meta language that we are using. Okay, so not the language per se. I mean, it's possible to interchange, it's possible to share because we share meta language. Okay, so in our ISO meetings, what we are, of course, we try to say, what is a noun? Do we agree what is a noun? Yes, we agree. But what we agree on is on the tags that we are using to share information. What you put between the tags, or how you tag your element. The element per se, it's not on the table when we have our discussions. Okay. What we, for instance, what we are trying now to discuss, so also with Ana Salgado, who is attending, is, for instance, what is a multi-word expression, for instance. We are having this discussion now for over 1 year, trying to see what is a multi-word expression, okay? And there you have, again, the tension. And why do you need that? Because we need to identify the term and we need to put a tag on the term. We don't have the discussion about the term per se, okay? That's the way that we are able, for instance, to put our database, our data into YATE, for instance, with the European database, okay? But they don't, in fact, they don't check the quality of language, okay? And what we do with Raquel is to check the quality of language. It's the end purpose of our work is to check quality of language. I don't know if I answered to your questions, Pedro, or if you have some. I don't hear you.
Pedro, sorry, you are muted.
No, it was super helpful, your various answers. I mean, it was a vague and open question anyway.
In any case, for us, it's very interesting because since you follow the work that you are doing in your group, and because, for instance, we know Rosalise very well, and we know the work she's doing. Well, the way you argue is very important for us, and we always think that there would be a complementarity, or our work would stop when yours begins, or the other way around. Okay, at some point we don't care anymore about. Well, it's interesting, but it's not what we are working on. But we need the result of other people's work in order to begin ours. So I mean, there is at some point where we think, well, we leave this to other people, or here they did their job, and we begin to work on our topics right now. So, and your questions are very, very interesting, and we will think We have some discussions about this in our group, of course.
I see that Eric has a follow-up. I have a small follow-up.
It's not a follow-up, but it's very short.
Okay,
so
I give you the floor, and then I make. We need to finish in like a few minutes.
It's very short. I just wanted to know whether you're working with, you're aware of Ganter and Wille's formal concept analysis. I can paste the link for the English version here. Maybe you can save it. If probably you have heard about it. I was wondering about that. It's very formal, unfortunately, but it's very interesting because it's feature-based analysis, and I mean that's very natural for linguists to use, and it's kind of powerful. It allows for concept discovery. So I was wondering whether you have been working with that, or with people who work with that. Okay.
I didn't know, but we will take a look at it and we will read it. Thank you.
I have the book on my shelf for years and hadn't had the ability the time to look at it either, so it's normal. But yeah, okay.
We will see. Thank you very much.
Thank
you. So I have maybe a bit of time just to, because what I have is a bit of a question, but maybe it's also an invitation to comment. Based on the questions that we were posing, and maybe Rute's latest comments that some people's work starts when the work of others finish, I have the impression, but that's what I want to share with you, and I want to hear what you think, is that your work requires maybe a little bit of stability already at the conceptual level. So maybe that's why COVID may be a bit of a challenge, because the more you have some domains that are already stable in terms of concepts, relatively stable in the sense that there's not contention about what things mean and how they're used. And maybe your work is the easiest in these kind of cases, where it's more challenging when you have domains that are either they're unstable because they're emerging, like all the story about COVID, but sometimes you have domains that are stable for years and then they're destabilized. If you think of history, of controversial historical periods, I don't know, colonialism, for example, apartheid and these kind of things. So from my perspective, I would want to know what you think about that, the level of stability that is needed for work to be done. And if you know of some work on ontologies that deals exactly with those moments of transition, when the concepts are rethought, when you have public discussions about what things mean, and if you see something that can be done at this stage, or if you really need the stability for your work to be done.
Well, I didn't put the question like that, but in fact, what we try is to achieve that stability in one specific moment to resolve one specific problem. Okay, so that's normally what we do. Of course, it's easier, let's say, to have an ontology if the domain is stabilized. I think we agree, so it's true. The other question is, well, in terminology, we have the discussions going on about what some people call about conceptual variation or linguistic variation, okay? And in this linguistic novelty, let's say we have, of course, neologisms that are coming up, and we have a lot of them in COVID-19, okay? And we are now going even to present the paper with the whole team between the, let's say, I call them terms between codes, because often they are not terms, but between the linguistic elements that you can find in communication and that we consider not to be terms, but we consider to be specialized vocabulary, okay, because they are not stabilized. So when what we call terminology, I say it in Portuguese, okay, because I don't know to spell it in English. So it's what we call terminologização or desterminologisation. I mean, you have elements that comes into language. They look like terms, but they are not, because they are not terms that are used in the by the domain experts. They are used by the media in order to make information eventually more transparent, more clear. We don't know yet, because we are going into that topic. Okay, so that's one important element. What we also do in this lag of stabilization is, in fact, we can work on diachrony. Okay, and diachrony in science, we have what I call short diachrony. Okay, we can find in terminology, you can have a diachrony in 5 years, in 3 years. Okay, when you look in history, well, we have 100 years, 8 years, but in terminology right now, there is a very big evolution on the knowledge that you have on the concept, and at the same time on the designation that you have of the concept. Okay, so you may find at some point, since the concept is not stabilized, you can find in the communication, you can find terms in the same text with the same author in page 1 and in page 10, they are using different words. And Sara, again, it would be very interesting to talk about the example of the video paper that we have. At some point, there is some, we were working on a video paper, and the person who was talking, so it was someone from the healthcare.
Yes.
So she said, for instance, we have 10 terms to designate this concept. Okay, and then she said, we will prefer the first one. And then during the whole communication, she never came back to the one she said that she would say. Okay, so she herself, she didn't stick to the decision that she made at the beginning of her communication. I don't know if you have the element, Sara, to show.
I can try to look it up if we have time. If not, then we can happily share that example.
Yes. So this would be very interesting, and I would eventually give the floor to Henrik, because he's writing here. And Henrik, if you want to say something. Thank you for attending.
Yes, I want to, of course, thank you all again for a brilliant seminar and the work that you do. I've been following it for years, so I know it. Just an example of, I didn't read all about diachrony, but a recent example that I'm studying now is this COVID certificate, where you can in real time study terminological variation. Already our authorities, they already named the electronic service which will provide you with the certificate. 2 weeks ago, they had to change it now again because the term was changed again by the EU. It used to be called the green certificate. So they named their service and launched the website with green. All of a sudden it was changed, and now it's the COVID certificate, digital COVID certificate. So they've changed again. So it shouldn't be, just because it's not stable, it should not mean that you shouldn't work on it. You could perhaps see this is why you should work on it the other way around, because you need to stabilize it. And if you do terminological work, studying discourse, and also look at the conceptual side with the characteristics, you come up with a definition that's sort of valid now. It could help to stabilize it quicker, perhaps. So this is another way to look, instead of shying away from unstable domains, you could see that as the inspiration or the motivation to actually work on it, although it won't be easy. This is for sure. Just an example.
Yeah, but I think in this case, it's exactly when you would have to consider the disagreement and take a position almost.
Yes, you have to. I think we have to take a position, but it's not the position of the linguist or the terminologist per se. It's always a position of a group of people, and inside a specific context. Okay, so only to say that Henrik Nilsson is from Stockholm. He's from Sweden, and he's a terminologist, and he is today the president of the European Association for Terminology. So thank you for attending, Henrik.
Obrigado.
Well, it's very difficult, in fact, to come up with a stable definition with a consensus. So that's, if you go into ISO standards, you can see that everything goes around consensus. And well, if you have a consensus at some point, well, in a few months, you don't have consensus anymore, and you have to change. And that's why you have to have, in fact, we should have an observatorio da língua, or observatorio do vocabulário. That's something that would be in some domains.
And especially the definition of consensus from one standard, it doesn't mean that everyone agrees.
Exactly.
This is important to remember. Consensus is a goal, but there will always be some unhappy people in that group, or often. The aim is to get everyone happy, of course.
I'm always unhappy in either. So,
okay, I don't know if Sara, you wanted to say something also, or Sara?
I just wanted to share. I don't know if you can hear me again, because I got a connection message. So I just wanted to say, out of just to add some extra information into the discussion, that this is also this idea of the multidimensionality of the concept is also being discussed at the moment at this cost action. I'll just paste the link to the cost action, Nexus Linguarum, because, you know, the original idea is to link. So the end goal is to link everything to everything. But of course, now questions start arising. For instance, what is the quality of the resources that are linked? Were they built under very different frameworks, and therefore are we linking what is not linkable from a logical perspective? And then what do we do with multidimensional concepts? What do we do with diachrony? So Henrik also pasted here an important note on, of course, work that has been done on that. And just to wrap up, in the working group that I'm leading at the moment, so use cases and applications, there's a use case in humanities. So someone from the digital humanities, they're really exploring. So there will be some deliverables coming up soon on the concept of Europe. So they're studying the concept of Europe, and again, it's multiple dimensions, and how they will be able to link, so to create resources, again, more within the scope of digital humanities, that are linkable to other resources, also from a linguistic standpoint, and the challenges that they're facing along the way. So again, in this overall website, you won't find, there's a section for publications. It won't be there yet. But again, I'm not publicizing the action concretely, but anyone can join it. So until the end of the action by 2023, anybody can join in and follow the discussions and participate in the working groups. So I just thought, you know, since this was I know that this is currently being discussed, so maybe it's of interest to some of you.
Thank you. Maybe I take this chance also. I think this is a good way also to end maybe this session. So I would like to thank you again for your presentation and for engaging with us, answering the questions and leaving us with more questions actually. So this is nice. It is also our last session of this year. So this season is finished. Stay tuned for more information about the next season. We start again late September, early October, more news soon. So thank you again, everybody, for being here. Thank you for the speakers, and see you again in September.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you to all of you. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.